you there. So please do submit your name for the waitlist. So we are joined this evening by Dr. Mickey Thomas Terry. This is a really terrific honor to have him here with us. Professor Terry comes to us from Howard University in Washington, D.C. He's an accomplished organist and has been on the faculty of Georgetown, a native of Greenville, North Carolina. He studied at the East Carolina University, Georgetown University, and is now the organist at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, Capitol Hill. And in addition to all of that, happens to be very knowledgeable, directly knowledgeable of our topic for the evening, which is the music of George Walker. So I'm going to get out of the way and let Dr. Mickey Thomas Terry take over.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Tonight, I want to talk about George Walker. I had the distinct privilege of being a friend of his for 25 years. And I got to know him very well. And I premiered and recorded a few of his organ compositions. And I'm going to talk about him, his life and his work, and what he was like as an individual. George Walker was born June 27th, 1922. His basic claim to fame these days is that he was the first Black ever to be awarded the Pulitzer Prize for music. This was done for a composition for soprano and orchestra that was written based on the poetry of Walt Whitman. And the Pulitzer Prize was awarded in April 1996. I remember rather well that situation because I actually was preparing dinner in my apartment that I had at the time in Alexandria, Virginia. And that evening, George Walker called me and told me, he said, Mickey, are you sitting down? And I was a little apprehensive, but I said, he doesn't sound distressed, so it can't be anything bad, I wouldn't think. But he proceeded to tell me that he had been awarded the Pulitzer Prize, and he had just found out. And I was absolutely elated. And of course, so was he. And it was just one of many wonderful moments that I had with him. George Walker was a native of Washington, D.C. He was one of two children. His sister was Frances Walker Slocum, who became the first Black tenured faculty member at Oberlin Conservatory. She was a pianist as well, a brilliant pianist. Had rave reviews. George Walker and Frances were the children of George Theophilus Walker and Rosa King Walker, both of which were from Jamaica, and they had moved to this country. Dr. Walker, Dr. George Theophilus Walker, was an MD. He graduated from the Temple University School of Medicine in 1918. And he moved to Washington. And they had a very comfortable life. They lived there on Sherman Avenue in Washington, in Northwest, not very far from Howard University campus. And his father was very, very well respected and owned properties and that sort of thing, and was a great support to his entire family, but particularly to the children. He was very proud of George as well as Frances. Both Frances and George, as children, attended the junior preparatory department of Howard University. Now that institute is defunct now. It no longer exists, but it really became sort of like a feeder school for the Conservatory of Music and School of Music at Howard University that existed for many years. And so you had a lot of talent. One of the things that George Walker and his sister did was to study piano as well as theory. And they had very fine faculty members, teaching there. And that really sort of gave him a solid foundation that he needed to build upon, and which he was to later build upon. He was rather a precocious child. He graduated from high school at the age of 14, after which he enrolled at Oberlin Conservatory in Oberlin, Ohio. Now, in terms of education for that period of time, there weren't a lot of opportunities for African Americans. Racism was live and well. And so a lot of institutions did not accept Blacks. Peabody Conservatory, which was just 40 miles away in Baltimore, and which is considered to be perhaps the oldest of the conservatories here in America, would not accept Blacks, did not accept Blacks really until 1953. That was the first graduate of Peabody Conservatory. Juilliard was established in 1926. They didn't accept Blacks. Eastman didn't until 1931. The first matriculating student was R. Nathaniel Dett. And he also received his master's degree from that institution in 1932. But that was pretty much it. Oberlin was quite different. Oberlin was established in the early part of the 19th century, and it was one of the first institutions to accept Blacks as students, and this began in 1835. It also is distinguished for being the first institution to accept women as students, matriculating students, and that was in 1837. So it had a very, very enlightened, let us say, view of the world. It was in 1937, the year after George arrived at Oberlin, that he decided to commit himself to the piano. And he worked very hard. He had an incredible work ethic, had it all of his life, really. And he, during his his senior recital at Oberlin in March 1941, actually has a quote in his autobiography where the newspaper reporter from the local paper there said it was consensus of opinion that he was, quote, the best and most artistic, it was the best and most artistic performance given by a conservatory student in several years. And that is a quote from George Walker's autobiography, page 39. George Walker's autobiography was published by the Scarecrow Press in 2009. So anyone that is interested in taking a look at it, it will give you a firsthand account of his life and experiences. In 1941, George Walker graduated at age 18 with highest honors from Oberlin Conservatory. 1941 was a very significant year, certainly pertaining to this evening, because it was that year in which he wrote this composition, which will be featured later on in your program, entitled Lyric for Strings. He wrote that while he was still a student at Oberlin Conservatory. The story behind that is this, that Walker had finished the first movement of his first string quartet. And he was, in the process of writing a contrasting slow movement. And he received the news in 1941 that his grandmother, his father's mother, had passed here in Washington. And of course, he was quite upset about that. And it was to his grandmother, Malvina King, that the work is dedicated. After his grandmother died, However, when George Walker went to Philadelphia, because he went to the Curtis Institute and attended there after he left Oberlin Conservatory. But it was in Philadelphia that he completed the 3 movements of his string quartet. And he said that there was a fellow student who was going to conduct a string orchestra comprised of Curtis students on a series of radio broadcasts that was being sponsored by a local Philadelphia bank. And so Walker suggested that to his friend that he could arrange his slow movement from his quartet for string orchestra. And this he did. And the original title was Lament for String Orchestra. Its first performance was given in what is now the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., but that was given by Richard Bales at the American Music Festival. And Walker later renamed the work to Adagio for string orchestra. But ultimately, he changed his mind again and gave it the name that it now bears, which is Lyric for Strings. George Walker entered the Curtis Institute, and he more or less had the idea of going there because Rudolf Serkin, who was teaching there at the time, came to Oberlin and played a recital, apparently a very brilliant one that really impressed George Walker during Walker's senior year. So he was drawn by both Serkin as well as the challenges of the Curtis Institute. So he enrolled, auditioned, was accepted and enrolled as a piano, performance, and composition major. So he was double major. His teachers were, his principal teachers were, of course, Rudolf Serkin for piano, and then Rosario Scalaro, who was also the composition teacher of Samuel Barber. Composition for George Walker really was a secondary interest when he first, in his earlier years, let's say, when he started to study it seriously. And he comments also in his autobiography, and I quote, "I had so much energy that I wanted to do something else after spending hours practicing at the keyboard," end quote. He believed that composition could improve his interpretive skills. While he was at Curtis, he distinguished himself as a pianist, and he also says that I was acknowledged to be the very best pianist, student pianist at Curtis. He makes some interesting comments in his autobiography about Rudolf Serkin. One of the things that he mentioned, which was very interesting, he said that Serkin really didn't discuss technique with him. Now, I don't know how many of you in the audience have heard any recordings of George Walker playing piano, but he was an extraordinary piano virtuoso. I've heard some recordings of him live performances of some incredible works, and he had a technical mechanism that was on the level of Horowitz. So it was no joke. He was the real deal, and it was an astounding technical facility, and one that he kept into his very, very advanced years. One of the things that George Walker said is that, and it disappointed him, is that Serkin never really encouraged him to pursue a concert career. He never discussed his future in terms of artist management or even competitions. And he felt a little disappointed by that. However, Serkin did say to him, and once again, I'm quoting from the autobiography, and that is, quote, "At your best, you are the equal of any pianist. The cream will always rise to the top," end quote from Serkin. But he continues to say, "But he never lifted a finger to help me get there." Scalero was very impressed with Walker and his ability to compose, and they got along rather well. In 1945, George Walker became the first African American to graduate from the Curtis Institute, and he graduated with an artist diploma. It was also in 1945 that he played his town hall debut there in New York City. Ephraim Zimbalist, who was at Curtis, arranged for his town hall debut. Now, George Walker was a first in many, many ways, but he was not the first Black pianist to play at town hall. There was a pianist that played many years prior to that. Her name was Hazel Harrison. And Hazel Harrison played at town hall in 1930. But Walker and Harrison were among the very few that had that opportunity. Walker said that Sirkin did not assist him in the preparation for that recital, nor did he attend, and he provided no excuse or apology for not attending. So that was hurtful to him, but he still received a very outstanding review from the New York Times for his town hall debut. Just shortly after that, in late November, actually about 2 weeks, he won the Philadelphia Youth Auditions. The judges were Eugene Ormandy and William Capel, and he played the Rachmaninoff Third Concerto with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And one of the Philadelphia news critics said that the performance was thunderous. After leaving Curtis, Walker was interested in pursuing a career as a concert pianist, and he sought management. He auditioned twice for Columbia artists, but nothing came from that. He said that he was rebuffed by them, and he said, quote, "I had encountered a pressure-resistant stone wall," end quote. Those were his words. In 1947, he took a trip to France and studied with Robert Casadessus. And one of the things that was also interesting that he notes is that on his passport, he had indicated that he was a concert pianist. But he noticed that, at least on the papers, but when they gave it back to him, they changed it to entertainer. And when he noticed it, he was absolutely outraged. And he demanded the reinstatement of the original designation as a concert pianist. This is one thing that brings me to an aspect of Dr. Walker's personality. George Walker was very forthright. He was no nonsense. He was about business. He was about perfection and accuracy. And he would tell you what he thought, whether it killed or maimed. But he was going to tell you what he felt. And that's the way it was. And if you were a friend or family member or a student or whatever, even a colleague, you came to know him in that sense because that's the way he really was. In 1950, George Walker became a member of the National Concert Artists. Now, Columbia and National Concert Artists at that time were the two leading concert managements for the piano in this country. But the Midwest regional representative told him that he would have a hard time selling a Black classical pianist. So he decided to take a European tour. So he went to Italy and England, Germany, and Amsterdam. The reviews that he received there were very fine. However, though, he was very susceptible to certain types of stresses. And he actually developed a set of ulcers while he was there. He was kept getting sick and he couldn't understand it. And it was actually his father, Dr. Walker, as I mentioned, was an MD, that diagnosed it, and that, you know, these ulcers were coming from stress. So he knew that he could not really afford to continue in that vein in terms of tours and that sort of thing. And then here in the United States, concert opportunities were lacking for African Americans. Um, the idea of having a concert, anything that was Black, was ignored. If it were at all entertained or heard of, I mean, people just didn't offer them opportunities. In the fall of 1953, he decided to cut his ties with National Concert Artists. And he realized that coveted performances were very, very rare. In a 1982 interview George Walker had with the New York Times, he stated, and I quote, "Those successes were meaningless because without the sustained effect of follow-up concerts, my career had no momentum. And because I was Black, I couldn't get major or minor dates." End quote. George Walker also said in the same interview, he said that his fellow white students at Curtis, and I quote here, were assured of 25 to 30 concerts a season. But I was lucky if I got 7. It was like being excommunicated from society. I was unwanted. End quote. Walker's father suggested that he take a teaching job to supplement his income. And it was at this time that George Walker decided to turn to teaching, which became a very great staple in his career. He accepted a job, his first job at Dillard University in New Orleans. He was teaching piano and theory down there. But it would so happen that Harold Shaw Concert Management, the same one that booked Horowitz for several years, wanted him to play. But he had to turn it down because he had accepted new duties at his new job. And the management never even replied or acknowledged his response. But that was the other thing about George Walker, too, is that he was a person of great integrity. While he was in New Orleans teaching, he had heard that the Eastman School of Music had developed a DMA program, a Doctor of Musical Arts, that was established by Dr. Harold Hansen, the director. So he just thought it would be a good idea to get his DMA in piano from Eastman. But before he could make plans to do that, his father passed. He was ill and he passed, and George Walker took care of him and of his estate. He left for Eastman in January 1955, and by December 1956, he received his doctorate of musical arts and a second artist diploma in piano. Walker's focus of activity as a professional musician was one, music composition, and the other was teaching. In terms of teaching, he held principal teaching positions such as at Smith College, where he became the first Black tenured faculty member. And he served many years at Rutgers University in Newark. He was a full professor there. And the reason he decided he wanted to go to Rutgers instead of New Brunswick, he said, is the fact that the Newark campus was closer to the city, to New York, and he wanted to be able to have quicker and greater access to the activities, artistic activities and cultural activities in New York. He still performed, however, whenever the opportunity presented itself. In terms of his awards, there were different types. There were several fellowships. He won 2 Fulbright fellowships. He won a Rockefeller, John J. Whitney, as well as 2 Guggenheim fellowships. He was awarded 7 honorary degrees, including one from the Eastman School of Music. And he had several awards that were given to him. One was the Dorothy Maynor Outstanding Art Citizen Award in 2000, the Classical Roots Award from the Detroit Symphony, which is 2001, and a number of other ones, the Aaron Copland ASCAP Award in 2012. I mean, it's a whole list of things for which he was recognized. He, in the year 2000, he was elected to the American Classical Music Hall of Fame. And in 1999, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And he had an award from them in 1982. So he had really established himself in a lot of different ways in terms of his profession, academically, as a composer, as a piano virtuoso. Now, I'd like to really talk about a little bit more about what George Walker was like. He was a very well-read man, very highly cultured, very urbane. He was, the thing that amazed me is even when he was 96, his mind was as sharp as a drawer full of razors. I mean, it was an incredible mind, intellect. It showed no signs or effect of aging whatsoever. And actually, in terms of being a physical specimen, he didn't age very badly there either. He never used a cane or any kind of assistance in walking whatsoever up until he was 95. And I remember I had a conversation with him when he was maybe about 94. And he told me, he said, you know, I live by myself. And he had a 2-story house. You know, I've been there. He said, I live by myself. I do my own grocery shopping, my own house cleaning. I cook. I, drive. And I can attest to the fact that he was a wonderful cook because I actually had a brunch there one time. He actually cooked waffles, and I don't think I've had waffles since that were wonderful. And I was really quite surprised to know that he was as skillful in the kitchen as he seemed to be in some other areas. So that was a very lovely surprise. One of the things that George Walker was famous for was his candor. And he didn't have a lot of patience with foolishness. He had issues, of course, with certain types of attitudes, racial stereotypes of Black people, and particularly musicians. And he really had one pertaining to the topic of jazz and the Black composer. And in his autobiography, he sort of takes this on, and I'm going to share this thought with you, what he's saying here. He says, and I quote, "No matter how much traditional training in classical music a Black artist has absorbed, there's the underlying suspicion for some that his native habitat is the real realm of jazz." A New York music critic could find little to comment on after a performance of my cello sonata in Val Hall, other than to mention a brief jazzy section in the third movement. The fugue was beyond his cognizance. All too often, a less than subtle depreciation of the intellectual capabilities and sensibilities of Black persons are manifest, end quote. George Walker, as a matter of fact, didn't play jazz at all. And he had a complete familiarity with it, but that was not his area, and that was not something that inspired him. I published an interview with George Walker for the Musical Quarterly. This was it came out in fall 2000. For anyone that's interested in seeing it, it's volume 84, number 3, fall 2000, the Musical Quarterly. And this interview it was an idea of mine. I have to tell you a little bit about that circumstance. I had been invited to play for the American Guild of Organists National Convention in Denver. This was 1998, summer of 1998. I was playing at the University of Denver in the chapel there. And George Walker had been commissioned by the American Guild of Organists, the AGO, to write a work. And so I was given the opportunity to premiere the work at the convention. There were 2 performances of it. It was one of the most difficult things I'd ever played, but it was entitled Spires. And this work he dedicated to me. And he was there for both performances, and he was very complimentary. But during that period of time I was in Denver, we were staying at the same hotel basically, so I suggested to him that we do an interview because I was interested in doing something for the Musical Quarterly. And the Musical Quarterly normally doesn't accept interviews for publication, but they wanted his because he, had not long ago won the Pulitzer Prize. And so anyway, we started the interview in Denver, and then it continued after that, even after he went back to New Jersey and I came back to Washington. We continued it over telephone, etc. And I asked him a lot of different questions, a lot of things, different topics about his attitude about things, about his compositions, about his experiences. One of the things I asked him about dealt with racism in classical music. This is what he had to say. And I quote, "Racism is alive and well in classical music. Its legacy, which has affected society in general, has left its imprint on performers and academics, as well as marketing moguls. There appears to be a systematic and exclusionary view of the importance and value of Black composers' works by musicologists and music critics," end quote. One particular instance that came up, which is footnoted, was something that I was quite familiar with myself because it had just happened around that time. There was a New York Times article. The date was August the 9th, 1998. And it was by Paul Griffiths, who was a music critic for the New York Times. The title of it was "Nothing But Newer Works, a Fantasy Season." Basically what this gentleman was doing was imagining the New York Philharmonic doing incredible works, and he picked 100 that he would love to see done. Out of that 100, there was not a Black composer represented. This is part of what George Walker was talking about, this idea of neglect or just ignoring. This is something that classical musicians have had to deal with. And so this is one of the things that he talks about. in his in that interview. My last conversation with George Walker came just about a week or so before he passed in 2018. And I remember him saying, and he kept saying it over and over, I want people to play my music. I want people to play my music. I want people to play my music. He said it 3 consecutive times. And when I received the news that he had passed, that phrase, that mantra played over and over and over in my head. I attended George Walker's wake in Montclair, New Jersey, September 2018. I was just finishing a seminar that day at Georgetown University, and I knew that it was going to be held that evening, and I left Georgetown around about 12 noon. I drove to Baltimore, where I had a former pupil to meet me. He took over my car, basically, because he's much younger, has a lot more energy. He drove me to Montclair so that I could attend the wake. And I remember when we pulled into the parking lot and I was walking to the building, the funeral home, hearing the sound of George Walker recording, his own recording of him playing his first piano sonata that was playing at the time. And I recognized it instantly. And when I got inside, I was greeted by his family. Interestingly enough, and this has a connection a little bit with your selection tonight, he was in a particular room. It was a closed coffin. And they had in the other rooms guests, and they had 2 screens that were running various videos and clips of him taken and photographs taken over the years. His music was playing. It was a celebration of his life. But when I walked to the coffin, and I was the only one in that part of the room, at the foot of the coffin was a copy of Lilacs, the piece for which he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. And just as I came to a stop, what piece of music would play but Lyric for Strings? And it brought back so much nostalgia. I was overwhelmed. So now whenever I hear that work, it always takes me back to that time, but it's not a sad time for me. It's a time when I can reflect upon his genius, appreciate his friendship, and his kindness. I feel very, as a matter of fact, I know I'm very honored to have known him and to have been able to call him a friend for 25 years. The work that you hear today or are going to hear this evening is perhaps his most performed work. It is incredibly beautiful. And I am just, once again, very honored to be asked to come here and to speak and to help honor him on this occasion. So I thank you. I thank you, the Elgin Symphony, Mr. Malmquist. I am very appreciative for this opportunity, and I hope you enjoy Lyric for Strings.
Thank you, Dr. Terry, for being with us. I really, really appreciate it. Would you mind taking a couple quick questions if we have?
Oh, I'll be happy to.
Terrific. Great. So if you have any questions, if you're watching on Facebook, go ahead and put them in the comment section. And if you're watching on Zoom, go ahead and put them in the chat section. And while people are thinking up some questions, I have a couple of my own that I think I'll get us started with. My first is, you mentioned that the Lyric for Strings was something that had been written when he was quite young. He was entering the Curtis Institute. Did he have what was his relationship to this piece? Did he feel that it represented his full skill, or was he? Some composers I find a little resentful of youthful success in these pieces. Did he like the piece?
He liked the piece. I mean, it wasn't like Ravel and Bolero or Rachmaninoff in the Prelude in C sharp minor. I understand Rachmaninoff was asked one time. He said, the person asked him, he said, Mr. Rachmaninoff, what do you think heaven would be like? And he said, any place that they're not playing the Prelude in C sharp minor. And basically what he meant by that was that even though he appreciated the piece, it did not represent him in all phases of his life. And he thought that he had made other more notable contributions. And people like what they like, but he did realize, of course, this was an early work and he appreciated people's interest in it. But if you listen to some of his later works, his poem for violin and orchestra, or one of his symphonias, Symphonia number 3 or 4, their harmonic language is quite different. He was a person that evolved as time went on, but one of the things that I've always felt, when he wanted to be lyrical, there's no one in the world that could outdo him. He was really quite incredible in that regard. And so, but his earlier works were a little more conservative. And then as he got older, like I said, the harmonic language progressed.
Sure. So I have another question here. Do you think that if he had not faced the blocks that he faced as a performer, as a pianist, because of race, do you think that he would have made the turn that he made to composition, or would he been more a kind of consummate performer?
It's hard to say, because he really was interested in being a concert performer, and it was hard to say. And he played everything, some of the most incredible things, but it's hard to say. Because composition originally was a means by and through which he could understand and interpret a work. If you are familiar with the structure of a work, you have a much better opportunity to play it well. But you have to understand its structure. And that seemed to be what he was doing. And like he said, he was highly energetic, and he was energetic all of his life. And, but that's a hard question to ask. I really don't know how I could answer that.
So I think I should probably note right now that I think that we have Gregory Walker, the former concertmaster, I believe, of the Colorado Symphony, here with us, and says that you did him justice, particularly the story about the waffles.
Hello, Gregory. It's nice to see you.
So I have two more questions here. One comes from Jim, who says, are the original scores safe with the family or institution, or are they a part of some independent collection?
They are, as I understand it, at Emory University. Gregory can speak to this better than I can, but Emory University has his collection. And Emory University, I mean, it's in good hands. I mean, Emory University has the collection of Dr. Martin Luther King and some other prominent people. So it's in very good hands.
Great. And then the last question I have is from Wesley, who asks, I'm sorry, thank you for your expertise and your candor. Why, in your opinion, are Black composers so often forced into the jazz label?
Really, because, and I do whole lectures on this at Howard University, believe it or not, but one of the reasons has to do with, a lot of it is racism. Um, you know, Thomas Jefferson wrote his notes on Virginia in 1784, 85, and he sort of sows the seeds of doubt right there because he talks about, his observations about, you know, society, colonial society at the time. He talks about, particularly where Virginia is concerned, and in it he talks about blacks or Negroes, and he makes observations and he sort of questions the ability of blacks to use advanced harmony or to use, complicated structural forms that are pretty much classic. Um, and a lot of people seem to have followed suit on that because, first of all, blacks were not given the opportunities to study as well as they could or should have in this country. Many of them went to Europe to study. Um, and came back over here to teach or whatever. And so, it's not a frame of reference that a lot of non-blacks have. So people just automatically assume that, it's something, just like religious music, people always refer to blacks singing gospel music. Well, I grew up in a church that did anthems and hymns and motets and that sort of thing. And it's not that rare. You have quite a few. And Washington, particularly during George Walker's early years, I mean, that's basically what you had. I mean, gospel was not allowed in most mainline churches until rather late in the 20th century. Most people are surprised about that. Howard University alone would not, until 1968, allow jazz or gospel to be performed on its campus. No HBCU, no black school did. It was classical music. That was it.
Yeah.
And maybe the Negro spiritual. That was it until after 1968.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. Um, I said I was going to be done after that question, but I just can't stop myself. Forgive me. And I have two questions here that I want. One, I'm going to be incredibly kind of uncouth here and ask Gregory to unmute and say a quick hello because I feel like, if you'll forgive me, Gregory, this is an incredibly cool opportunity to have not only a friend but also a family member of a composer that we're going to be seeing. So can I make a quick introduction?
Absolutely. I'm right here for as long as my phone battery lasts.
Terrific. Well, very good. Well, I mean, everyone, this is I can introduce you professionally and personally here. He's the current concertmaster, former concertmaster.
Well, I've been soloist with Colorado Symphony a few times. I was actually concertmaster of the Boulder Philharmonic Orchestra, a little farther north.
Fair enough. Yeah, very good. Well, anyway, thank you so much for joining us today. This is terrific, and you've played a great number of your father's works, I believe.
That's right. So I can definitely empathize with Mickey, and even though it's only been a couple of years since my father's passing, just to hear him describe things reminds me that between you and me, it wasn't a dream. It was real. Other people kind of experienced him in the way that I did. So that goes for a personal level. But in terms of playing the music, I think everybody's going to get a taste of the kinder, gentler George Walker this evening with Lyric for Strings. And as Dr. Terry has alluded, there is another side to him that is fraught with challenges for performers and listeners alike. And it's all part of the George Walker package.
Well, and if I'm not mistaken, if anybody wanted to track that down, they would have to just search your name, and they can find some of the more the more hard-edged tonal language of your father that you perform. There's a solo. Yeah.
Yes, you'd have that violin concerto in there, the poem for violin and orchestra, solo violin, blah, the violin sonatas, pretty strong representation on YouTube. Let's just say I'm probably not running for office anytime soon.
Well, I can jump in here and just say one thing. Dr. Gregory Walker here is one of the most incredible virtuoso violinists around. And to watch anyone with the facility to play his father's work, I mean, it requires absolute mastery of the violin. I mean, you can't, approach it any other way. You have to be a master of the instrument.
And you two had been acquainted, I assume. Very good.
Oh, yes. Dr. Terry, we've considered him an extended family member, and it's just very poignant that he's here to represent for all of us tonight.
Well, I can't tell you. I mean, it's an incredibly cool opportunity for an orchestra to be able to play a composer's music for the first time, meet a friend, meet a family member, and really, I mean, we didn't get to make this kind of introduction to Beethoven, so this is nice that we get to do it right. So anyway, thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank
there
you.
are other questions here, but I think that we'll leave it here. It's just a kind of symphony of thanks to both of you for being with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you.